Alright, so I'm gonna break a rule that you're really not supposed to break when it comes to the original Resident Evil games. And that's admitting that the original Resident Evil 2 was not my favorite classic Resident Evil title. That doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it, far from it in fact. It's the game that introduced me to the Resident Evil franchise after all, and will always remain with me for what it is/was. And in case you wanted to know which of the classic Resident Evil games was my favorite, it was Resident Evil 3. When I heard that Resident Evil 2 was getting a remake, I was pretty psyched, and the Resident Evil series as a whole has been a series that's been near and dear to my heart. But I can't say that I wasn't apprehensive, as despite the success that Capcom has had with Resident Evil 7, past games in the series have been a little lackluster. Which is why I can honestly say I'm surprised how much I enjoyed the Resident Evil 2 remake. But it's not perfect. Not by a long shot. So, for those who are unfamiliar with Resident Evil, the game takes place over 20 years ago. God, I'm fucking old. In the fictional Midwestern town of Raccoon City. You'll take control of either Leon Scott Kennedy, a rookie cop, or Claire Redfield, a college student looking for her brother Chris Redfield, who was also a main character in the original Resident Evil, before he grew into a massive boulder-punching monstrosity. The two both find each other shortly after the city succumbs to a massive outbreak, leaving the city swarmed with the undead. However, it isn't long before the two are separated and largely have their own connected, but mostly isolated adventure.
Don't shoot!
Get down!
The game is entirely played through a third-person, over-the-shoulder camera, a camera scheme very similar to Resident Evils 4, 5, 6, and the Revelation series. For those who think this is a deal-breaker since it doesn't keep the static camera angles of the original Resident Evil 2, I implore you to give the game a try, as the change in gameplay and perspective, well, it simply works. While you visit a few different locations, the majority of the game takes place in the Raccoon City Police Department. Those who are familiar with the original will probably get a heavy, nostalgic feeling, not unlike visiting an old friend that you haven't seen in years. Assuming, of course, you didn't just finish playing the original like I did. This familiarity will dissipate as you notice how much of the police department has actually changed. And this is very apparent in the front hall of the station itself. In the original, the front hall was quiet and empty, acting like the eye of a hurricane, peaceful, but with a maelstrom of trouble around it. It becomes quickly apparent in the remake that things are not going to be how you remember them. Everywhere you look, there is evidence of how the police department was used as a makeshift sanctuary, one that has since fallen to ruin to the monsters infesting the city. This ambiance permeates the entire police station with bloody sleeping bags and barricades that have either fallen or failed due to the infection spreading beyond them. This dark atmosphere is somewhat of a contrast to the brightly lit version in the original, even if both police stations had fallen to hell. This dark atmosphere combined with the brilliant sound design makes the police department much more terrifying. As your protagonist of choice makes their way through the police station, they will run into zombies, monsters, zombies, puzzles, and more zombies. There's also a fun little stalker you'll get towards the second half of the game, but we'll talk no more about him here. For the most part, both characters' traversal through the police station is identical, minus one or two factors. Leon and Claire will obtain different weapons, with Leon getting a shotgun, magnum, and flamethrower, and Claire getting a grenade launcher, submachine gun, and shock rifle thing. I don't really know what the fuck this thing is, but it's somewhat useful, so meh. You will also be introduced to different side characters, one of which will be central to each character's story. with Claire meeting a young Sherry Birkin and Leon running into the mysterious FBI agent, Ada Wong. You may notice that I'm referencing the original a lot, which I feel is unavoidable to an extent, but I don't want people to think that you have to have played the original to appreciate the remake, as it fully stands on its own. If you have played the original though, I think you'll get some pretty great surprises with this one, as unlike the remake of Resident Evil 1, which was pretty much a one-to-one retelling of the original story, but with some few additions, Resident Evil 2 takes the themes and characters of the original but is largely its own beast. After you've completed the game once, you'll get to run through a mode called the second run, which is basically just a mode where you see what the other character was doing throughout your entire game. There are some minor differences on how the story begins and ends, but going back it's going to feel largely similar to the original run. Now, as I mentioned, the game is not perfect, and I do have one big gripe with the game that primarily involves its story, which for those who haven't played the game is a big no-no to spoil. So, if you want to save the story for yourself, please skip to the point that you see on your screen, as I want you to be able to explore the story for yourself. Go ahead, I'll give you a moment.
Jesus Christ!
Are you gone? Good. Now, like I mentioned, there are two versions of the story, with the first run and the second run. This is an echo of the original game, which had two variations of the story depending on which character you played as first. In the original game, this was known as Leon A and Claire B, or Claire A and Leon B. And depending on which one you played, there were actually different things that happened in the story. For instance, in Leon A, Ada threatens to kill Leon after he accidentally obtains a sample of the G virus. The reason she does this, for those of you who don't know, is because she's actually a mercenary, not an FBI agent, and her goal is to obtain the G virus and sell it. Granted, in the original she doesn't pretend to be an FBI agent at all. In the end, she can't go through with shooting Leon, but it doesn't end up mattering much since she's immediately shot by Annette Birkin. After this, she ends up falling down a reactor shaft to her death. In Leon B, however, she manages to obtain a sample of the virus on her own when Sherry Birkin accidentally drops it. So instead, her death comes into play when Leon is being chased by his stalker, a massive tyrant by the name of Mr. X. Mr. X has Leon cornered, so Ada puts a couple of magazines worth of pistol rounds into him, causing him to fall into a vat of liquid metal. But not before she's thrown into a console where she dies in Leon's arms. Now the new version of the game doesn't do this, and Ada's fate is the same no matter whether Leon is played second or first. What this means is that there's no real reason that you have to play all four versions of the game, because the main story is going to be the same no matter who is played first or second. The only real changes are that one character meets Marvin at the beginning of their story, while the second character is going to defeat the final boss at the end. This is actually perfectly fine, since it's okay if they wanted to streamline the story into one cohesive plot. However, from a gameplay standpoint, it's going to mean that both characters are going to run into very similar situations. And by very similar situations, I mean the exact same situations. You see, the way that they streamlined their story, they actually made the story not make a whole lot of sense. Since you'll end up beating a boss as one character, only for the boss to come back and make you have to beat them again as the other character. This becomes a big WTF moment when you fight one of the major bosses at the end of the game. So let's say you play as Claire and find your way into the underground lab. You end up finding a sample of the vaccine for the G virus, which Sherry has become infected with. Upon leaving, you run into a massive boss known as G. Annette comes out and gets injured and almost crushed to death by the monster. Claire gives her the vaccine and ends up fighting the monster on her own. She eventually makes her way back to Sherry, and unfortunately Annette succumbs to her wounds and dies. Now, let's flash forward to the second playthrough with Leon. Leon ends up making it to the exact same place that Claire does, but instead ends up taking the remaining sample of the G virus. So far so good, right? However, upon leaving, G attacks again. Annette comes out of nowhere and is nearly killed, again. Immediately after, Leon runs into Ada. Leon reveals that he knows that she's a mercenary. She threatens to kill him before she gets shot by Annette, who immediately succumbs to her wounds and dies. Again. What?
fucking kidding me?
This is a problem, obviously, as it makes a canon plot impossible. The original version of the story had a few plot holes that came up here and there, but largely the story made sense. And for the remake to completely destroy any sort of continuity is it's just disappointing. I'd actually argue that this is even worse than the story issue that the original Resident Evil had. And in that game, there wasn't a single ending that could be considered canon. The reason for this is that an entire character was omitted depending on which character you are playing as, with Rebecca not showing up in Jill's playthrough and Barry not showing up in Chris's. Both characters went through the same instances and the same situations, but it didn't really matter in that game because the story isn't billed as both characters doing these at the same time, as only one character is supposed to be the protagonist. I kind of chalk this up to them not really planning on doing a sequel, so having a different character in both playthroughs actually made the game more interesting because you felt that you were seeing something new if you played as the other character. The original Resident Evil 2, however, was made with the thought that both players were off doing their thing at the same time, and both A and B scenarios were supposed to be happening in tandem. For the remake to end up in a situation where this becomes impossible, it's not something I appreciate. I mean, honestly, this isn't the worst thing in the world, but for a story junkie like myself, it's a giant pus-filled boil that mars an otherwise beautiful game. Another gripe that I have that's not as significant is the fact that both Claire and Leon barely run into each other. They meet at the very beginning, when one character arrives at the police station, and then at the very end. While in the original both characters were off doing their own stories, at least they would have moments where they were trying to keep in contact with each other. In this game, they rarely give a shit what the other character is doing. I mean, seriously, listen to this scene with Claire towards the very end of the game.
Okay. Alright, it's working.
Claire!
What? Leon? You're down here too?
Yeah, but the whole place is coming down. Look, you need to get out. Fast!
I know. I found a way out. I think we can all make it. Where are you now?
Seriously, it sounds like she completely forgot that Leon even existed. For me, the story-related issues are Resident Evil 2's biggest downfall. Yes, I would largely say that the game is great, and this may just be a major annoyance for me, but I can't help feeling that screwing up the story like this was a terrible, terrible idea. Anyway, I'm done. Rant over, spoiler over. Alright, so I feel like I've spent half this review tearing this game apart, and I really don't want that to be the case. The atmosphere is top-notch and the controls are great, even if they do feel like they have a few quirks. For instance, there are times where it feels like the game really should have a dodge button, but it's one of those things that you'll get used to as you play through the game a bit more. The RE engine used in the game manages to make everything look both disgusting and beautiful at the same time. I would wholeheartedly recommend this game if you are a big fan of Resident Evil. Hell, I would recommend this if you are a fan of horror games in general. I just wish that the stupid decisions that were made with the game's story had been remedied. I'm not a game designer, so fuck it.
I'm guessing you don't have a key in one of those fancy pockets?
Unfortunately, no.
Hey, thanks for watching my review for Resident Evil 2. I swear I didn't mean for this to be as negative as it ended up being, but if you liked the review, please give me a like, and if you didn't like the review, tell me, let me know why. I love discussing games and I have no problems with criticism. Also, if you enjoy my content, feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.